Hello everyone, it's Aaron Christensen with Horror 101 with Dr. AC, and welcome back to Scare-A-Thon 2024, benefiting the Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project. It's our second week of Box Set Thursdays, and today we're going to be talking about Severin's Danza Macabra Volume 3, the Spanish Gothic Collection, and I've got a couple of awesome guests to chat about it with me. So we're going to bring in John Kitley and Troy Howarth. Thank you, gentlemen. Looking forward to chatting tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking us.
So the features in this box set are NECROPHAGOUS, 1971, Cake of Blood, 1971, Cross of the Devil from 1974, and Night of the Walking Dead from 1975. And I'm just going to show, it's a really handsome box set, as their other packages have been. Again, this is volume 3. So you have this slipcover case, and then you've got the different regular jewel cases. So let's kick things off with our discussion of NECROPHAGOUS, 1971. This was known, John, apparently we watched this for Turkey Day, and I'd completely forgotten it until Frank Branya came up, and I went, oh, that's right. I remember watching this. What made you pick that one for Turkey Day? Because I have to say, watching it this time, I was like, this seems to have a little bit more going for it than our usual Turkey Day fare.
It was under Graveyard of Horror title. When I had seen it originally on VHS, the monster's kind of cheesy at the end. It's got some great elements to it. It's got a fantastic cast. You got Victor Israel in there, so it's a win right there. But if you look at all of the Spanish horror, it's a little bit more cheesier, I think, than most. I have not watched this new Blu-ray. This is the only one out of the box set that I have not revisited because it was the only one that I had really seen in somewhat decent quality. Mm-hmm. But I am looking forward to going back to it and take a better look at it.
And Troy, you've seen this most recent version, right? The Severin release?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a big difference between what the independent international release was and this one?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. Honestly, I'm really not sure. I'd never seen it before. I think I'd seen clips, but I'd never actually watched the film in its entirety before. I was always kind of put off because I kept hearing about how terrible it was. And I'm not one of these people who kind of I don't believe in the so bad it's good kind of school, and I'm not big on kind of mocking films. I just, but I'm not the type of person that says, oh, it's, I like to watch lousy movies. I want to watch something that actually looks like it might be interesting. So I kind of avoided it for a long time, but I guess it's a good thing I waited because, this is certainly the best it's ever likely to look, I would imagine.
And how'd the film itself go down for you?
I thought it was fun. Maybe it helped that I had been told pretty much nothing but negative things. I expected this terrible film, and I thought, it's not a masterpiece or anything, but I thought it was kind of disarmingly sincere, which is something that's kind of rare in genre films altogether these days. Everything's gotten very sort of self-aware and meta, and there's a heavy kind of mocking sense of irony that's in a lot of horror films. These not completely, not across the board. That's obviously not true of everything, but to see something like this that is just such a, in a way, it's an old-fashioned throwback to sort of 1930s or 40s style mad scientist movie. Really, it's not even comparable to a 60s film. It seems to be a throwback in a way that certain other Gothic films of that period were, like Mario Bava's Baron Blood, for example. But it was done with a great deal of sincerity, I thought. And although, it's obviously a guy in a cheap rubber mask at the end, there was something about that, the idea of a mad scientist just turning himself into a potted plant that I just thought was kind of cute. I ended up enjoying it. And like John said, there's a lot to be said for the cast. Victor Israel, the wall-eyed character actor from Horror Express and, Witch's Mountain, and has so many other, he's kind of the Spanish Michael Ripper or the Spanish Luciano Pagozzi. He's always great. And Frank Branya, who you mentioned, who looks like a Jerry Anderson kind of marionette come to life. who we've seen in so many spaghetti westerns, and of course also Pieces, and Return of the Evil Dead, the second Blind Dead movie. They give the movie a lot of gusto, I think. So I liked it. I mean, it's not great, but I thought it was a pleasant enough hour and a half time killer.
And one of the things that kind of struck me as I was watching is that it's a kind of combo of the Gothic horrors. I mean, clearly kind of like throwing back what you were saying, Universal, but also like the Hammer feel. But also there's kind of like these giallo elements to it, where you have these mass killers running around in the graveyard, and the mystery, you know, like Michael Sherrington, you know, disappears after coming home to find that his wife is dead, and then she's not in her grave. So there's all sorts of mystery about like who the killer is, who's actually dead, who's alive. So the mystery and the Gothic elements, it does just feel like everything got thrown in a blender and went, hey, let's make a Spanish horror film that's every little ingredient that's on the table here.
I do remember there was a VHS release in a big box that I'd look forever, but it looked like the artwork was done by a 7-year-old with crayons.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a legit release, but it literally was with like crayon artwork. And you're like, that's what you're going to put on there?
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of I think it was the actual poster for a movie I'm very fond of called Grave of the Vampire, a low-budget American horror film in the 70s. Very effective movie, very nasty and I think genuinely scary. And you see this poster and it's, oh my God, oh, it looks so cute. And then you see the movie, it's like, oh, this is pretty vicious. I mean, it's surprising what they would sometimes do to promote these things. I guess in the case of this particular film, you could argue that artwork is probably closer to the mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, certainly, yeah. That's kind of what they have as their main cover art is. Yeah. Although even that looks better than what we see in the movie. And one of the things that I noticed, like there's some continuity issues in terms of like snow, no snow. You know, it's a beautiful day, and then you got poor Victor Israel like just standing there giving a scene with just snow blowing in his face, and this was I wasn't aware of this, but this film won the first Best Director prize at Sitges in 1971. Wow. It split it with a film called Loki's, but our director, Michael Skaife, aka Miguel Madrid, was one of the first winners of the Sitges Film Festival for Best Director. Now, there's a fun little interview with the daughter of Antonio Rafaelis on the disc, and she's talking about how they gave that award, and she's like going, Loki's was very good. This film, I don't know why they gave this. I mean, they must have thought we want Spanish representation or something. But yeah, she was kind of like just bewildered all these years later. It's like how that happened.
I would say it was a bad year, except it was in 1971. My God, think about some of the other horror films that were out that year. It's from Italy, from America, from Great Britain, from Spain. I mean, somebody greased somebody's palms there, I think.
For sure. Yeah.
Either that or there was 2 films and entered those 2. And that was
exactly. Well, and it's interesting. I love it's like a little mini documentary that's on there, but it talks about the Sitges Film Festival, which is in Sitges, Spain. And it is the first and oldest horror film festival in the world. It started off in 1968 as a festival. And then in 1971, they started doing actual competitions where you could win awards. But it's on my bucket list of places I want to get to before it's all over. Let's bounce down to our second film, Cake of Blood from 1971. I had never even heard of this one before. And it turns out it's an anthology film, which is one of my favorite kinds of horror genre offerings, because you're always going to find one in there that you like. What were people's feelings on Cake of Blood?
It's funny you put it that way. I'm trying to think, is there such a thing as a horror anthology without at least one? Well, I don't know. Maybe I would go with, I'm feeling John might disagree, but I'm not sure. Gallery of Horrors would probably be my pick. Ooh. There wasn't anything good there.
You know what, Troy? You stand. I stand with you on that one because I've seen that a couple of times. Going, maybe it's not as. Oh no.
No, it's bad. It's bad.
It is tragically bad.
Yeah, it really
what's it
is.
called?
Gallery of Horrors. Yeah,
Lon
it had
Chaney,
Lon Chaney and John Carradine.
Jr. Lon Chaney, and it's oh my god.
Yeah.
But back to this film.
Back to this film. Yeah, I have to admit, most anthologies are uneven. I can name a bunch that I think are pretty consistently excellent, but most of them are uneven. There's usually at least one or two dud segments, sometimes more. But this one was kind of all over the map for me. I didn't like all of the stories equally, but I can't say I disliked any of them completely.
Right.
And I really liked the last story in particular. I thought that one was especially interesting, partly because of the cast. There's some very familiar faces in that segment, which helps. But it has this sort of weird Harold Pinter kind of vibe to it that I really appreciated. So I think that was my favorite of the segments.
And I'll just go ahead and rattle off our different. We had 4 different stories in there. One is called Tarot. The other is Victor Frankenstein, Terror Among Christians, and The Dance, also known as Emotional Survivals. Yes, Emotional Survivals. But yes, that last one is. I like the opening and the closing ones especially. I thought that, and as you said, Troy, they are kind of all over the place. Like they do get a little bit of this and that. There is a reference to various kind of monsters, and you get vampires, Frankenstein, ghosts, and then this last one is kind of like you said, more of a kind of a human scare. Perhaps something from beyond the grave. John, what were your thoughts on Cake of Blood?
Well, when Severin announced this, and I like to consider myself somewhat of an experienced Spanish horror film goer. Never heard of Cake of Blood and never heard of Night of the Walking Dead. So I was immediately very excited because if you can bring me something that I've never seen. When I got the set, I watched Cross of the Devil. I watched The Walking Dead, and then this one last. By the time I got to this one, it was a long evening.
Oh, you did a marathon. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I wanted to watch the ones that I had never technically seen before. I'd seen Cross of the Devil, but we'll get to that in a minute. This one was a little dreamy, artsy.
For sure.
Weaving in and out. So I need to go back and watch it more with a refreshed mind. I love seeing the cast, some of the cast, like Troy said, you see some familiar faces from a lot of the Spanish horror films, which was kind of cool, especially some that are just in little bit parts, but have a bigger role in this one. I thought was good. But it is tough to make a solid anthology film from front to back. There's always going to be one of them that just doesn't either fit the mold of the rest of them or tries to be slightly different, like either more of a comedic tone to it. So I do remember these being a little uneven. So you were kind of like waiting for the next one to start because this one is a little rough. But like I said, I do need to go back and rewatch it because I was tired after the first 2.
Well, and this one does kind of call back to Dead of Night, the 1945 British horror, in that we have different directors for each segment. And that kind of fell out of fashion throughout the 60s and 70s with the Amicus films, where they were all directed by a single director. And then later in our more modern era, with the VHS movies and things like that, we started seeing that return to having a different director for every segment.
Right.
It was something that was going on then, though, especially in more sort of art house cinema, where you had things like Spirits of the Dead, and a variety of different anthology films that were by major kind of European auteur directors. So you would get Boccaccio 70. There's a segment by Fellini, one by Visconti, Monticelli, De Sica. So it was kind of in that tradition, I think. In Dead of Night, absolutely. I mean, this was. In a way, apart from the first film, they're all kind of ambitious. I mean, I think that's the one thing that was really interesting about them all. they all kind of clearly weren't content with just being kind of the same old,
Right.
and they were trying something different. And it's one of those things where, maybe occasionally their reach exceeded their grasp, but ultimately I appreciated the effort.
And Troy, are you familiar with these directors? Because I didn't recognize them. I don't think a lot of them did a lot of horror stuff.
No, I don't. In the case, I mean, other directors in this set, absolutely. I'm familiar with John Gilling and Leon Klimovsky, certainly in a big way. But these directors, no. And I looked them up at the time, and it looked like most of them didn't really have particularly prolific film careers.
Right.
In some cases, these were kind of their first forays or very early forays. And well, again, there are signs of that in this because, I don't know, you hear a title, Cake of Blood. I mean, what the hell is this going to be? And it could have gone in any number of different directions, but clearly these were kind of intellectual filmmakers who were trying to give a kind of interesting dissertation on different types of fear. In that sense, it reminds me of Mario Bava's Black Sabbath, which he very clearly in that film wanted to explore different types of fear in that movie. So that's what we get here as well. I don't think as successfully, but again, A for effort.
Well, it's hard to match up with Bava's Black Sabbath. That is absolutely one of my favorite anthology films. And yes, I think you're right that I think these were folks who were trying to dabble in the idea of the fantastic and horror. And yes, they were more experimental type of directors. But yeah, I wasn't familiar with any of them. But I thought since you have a greater depth of knowledge by far, I thought maybe I'd see if they were any of them were familiar to you.
I don't know about depth of knowledge. I mean, I know a fair amount about Spanish cinema, but not as much as I do about Italian cinema or British cinema.
And we're not getting our usual players like Osario and,
normally you would expect there to be somebody that you would say, oh, this guy did a Paul Naschy movie later on, or this, no, there was none of that. So these were, again, these were directors obviously who were interested in kind of working within the genre, but doing it in a different way. So I don't know. I don't have the figures, but if I had to guess which movie out of this set was the least successful at the box office, it was probably this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It reminded me more European than Spanish.
Yeah.
Other than the cast, it just didn't seem to have that same feel. And to Troy's point, that's, I think, what they were trying to do.
It doesn't have that earthy quality that I associate with Spanish horror films, which is very different from the more sort of slick and sleek Italian films. It is going for something more continental, more highfalutin in a way. For
sure. I mean, that first segment with the conquistador kind of moving through the landscape. I mean, there seems to be some perhaps blatant references to Seventh Seal. Like they're referencing other films. I mean, Frankenstein, it's very clearly referencing, the Mary Shelley novel. I kind of liked the spin that they took on it, where we had a non-monstrous monster who really does just murder because he doesn't know what mortality is, And I thought the ending of that was actually kind of poetic with the scientist and the monster kind of meeting a mutual end.
Yeah, no, that was interesting. The first segment you mentioned, we should mention the actor Julian Ugarte,
right?
Who, of course, is the vampire in Paul Naschy's breakout film La Marca d'Hombre Lobo, or Frankenstein's Bloody Terror, and also he was the hippie cult leader in Sergio Martino's All the Colors of the Dark as well. So. He's another familiar face. Always nice to see these from every country's got them. I mean, if you're watching British movies, you expect certain actors, Italian films, etc. And it's nice to have these actors present, even though it's kind of different from the typical kind of genre stuff they would be doing around that time.
Let's bump on to Cross of the Devil. And John, you said you had not seen this one before, or you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Because this was never available. Well, because it was never available, you had to go for bootlegs. And I went from one that you could see more clarity on the old scrambled on TV adult films than I could see on this original version of Cross of the Devil.
I'd have no idea.
I said, what are you talking about? Scrambled adult films.
And then I upgraded it to one that you could kind of see, but the subtitles were garbled out because of the poor quality. So this was the first time I technically saw the film. And of course, because it was written by Paul Naschy, that was a huge connection. You got to get a hold of this film because he wrote it. He didn't star or do anything other than write it. And John Gilling directed it, I love his work that he did with Hammer, The Flesh and the Fiends. But watching this finally in glorious color, it's like, it's okay. It's not it is a somewhat of a Blind Dead film, but definitely would be after Diosario's four films.
Troy?
Well, I'd seen it. Of course, I'd seen it a couple of times before, including when I did my book on Naschy. It was an essential title to see because it was a script that he was particularly proud of, and he wanted to star in it, and he fully expected to star in it, and it didn't happen. And he wasn't involved in the finished project. And of course, inevitably, he spent the rest of his life bad-mouthing it and everybody associated with it, which I can understand, although, to be objective, I think, perhaps things weren't quite entirely the way that he made it out to be. But certainly John Gilling coming on and directing it, first of all, was very unusual because he's an Englishman who had moved to Spain to basically retire and paint. And how he became involved, I don't really entirely know. It was a big controversy at the time because it's a Spanish film. Why are you getting an English director? Why not give it to Leon Klimovsky? Why not give it to Carlos Ared? It at one point was intended apparently to have kind of a bigger star cast. I think people like Christopher Lee were approached or considered. Klaus Kinski, I believe, was considered. James Franciscus, various different people of kind of greater international pedigree than the actors they ended up going with. Although the movie does have a good cast with a lot of familiar faces in it. I think it's a very interesting film. I think it feels a little bit to me kind of like a later film that Freddie Francis directed called The Doctor and the Devils, which was based on a Dylan Thomas script. And of course, it was radically revised. And, Freddie Francis, of course, he directed a lot of really good films for Hammer and Amicus, but he never really liked horror movies. I mean, he didn't like them. He was very open about that. And this became obvious after a while, especially most of his 70s movies aren't very good. And you can just tell he's just like phoning it in. But then he makes this bigger film for Mel Brooks with a big cast and big production values. And it feels like the type of movie that's made. It's a horror movie made by people who don't like horror movies. And I kind of got the same vibe out of Cross of the Devil to a certain extent. As good as Gilling had done at Hammer within that structure, I felt like somehow here, I don't know, it was going for something very different. It's an adaptation of the works of Becker, who is a huge literary kind of god within the Spanish culture. He's kind of the Spanish Edgar Allan Poe. We don't know much about him. I don't think much of his work is even available in English, so we can't really, unless you're bilingual or multilingual, you wouldn't have any appreciation of him. But that was a big deal, an adaptation of Becker's stories with an English director, and obviously watching the movie, they put some real money into it. It's a good-looking film, but it's simultaneously, it's that kind of dreamy thing that I really do like, but at the same time, it's not as interesting as I'd like it to be.
Do either of you know were there other adaptations of Becker? Was he somebody who was adapted to the screen often in the way that Poe has been?
I did not do any research ahead of time. I have to confess. I would think so. I would imagine there's probably been some, but obviously not to an extent that's created any kind of real international awareness. Because I think most people outside of Spain are like, who? They don't know. But
I certainly was. I mean, just looking at watching one of the featurettes where they were talking about, I mean, Naschy was very passionate about doing a Becker adaptation because he was the Spanish Poe, and Naschy liked to check all of the boxes. I want to get a vampire, I want to get a werewolf, I want to get a mummy.
Yeah, and you could see him playing the kind of creepy, otherworldly character that's in the film. I forget the name of the actor that played it. Obviously, physically very different from Paul Naschy, so it would have been a very different film. I don't know. I mean, I kind of wish he would have had an opportunity to have realized it the way he wanted to, but he didn't. And what we have is what we have, and I think it falls in the category of an interesting film more than anything else.
Yeah, it stars Emma Cohen, who's got the saddest eyes in all of Spain. And she was in Horror Rise from the Tomb. So the minute I saw her in the cast, I'm like, I'm in. This is gonna be great. And again, it is definitely worth seeing. A, if you're a Naschy fan. B, if you're a Spanish horror fan, and you're going to be able to see it in the best quality it's ever been.
Yeah. And I don't remember the actor's name, but the guy who's the bald guy with the beard, kind of like the man, the doctor who's
that's the part Naschy was going to play. I'm sure.
Oh man, well he does a terrific job. Like I think he's absolutely the most interesting character in the film.
Yeah, there's some other familiar faces too. Eduardo Fajardo's in it. He was in Lisa and the Devil for Bava. He was the bad guy in Django by Corbucci, and he's in Knife of Ice by Umberto Lenzi. I mean, he's just a good solid character actor. And
who is he playing Cohen in the film?
Oh God, I can't remember.
Is he the husband, the brother-in-law?
I can't remember.
Okay,
honestly, it's been a while. I don't remember for sure. I'd have to look that up. But just to follow up on what John was saying too about Emma Cohen, I mean, Horror Rise from the Tomb, of course, but also she won an award for a Jess Franco movie called The Other Side of the Mirror, which is a really wonderful film. Even if you're not a big Jess Franco fan, that one's well worth checking out.
Cool. What's it called again? Other Side of the Moon?
Other Side of the Mirror.
Mirror. Okay. And last but not least, Night of the Walking Dead, 1975. I had not heard of this one either, and it was a very interesting in terms of like kind of watching it play out because it never is. I kept waiting to kind of figure out where it was going because it's a very kind of there's a mystery as to who these people are. And what their intentions are. But John, this was new to you too, right?
This was brand new, and I absolutely loved this film. I think this is, for me, watching it is what the Spanish horror Gothic of that era. That's what it feels like. Again, you have Emma Cohen back again on this one. Klimovsky's directing it. It has all the trappings with the fangs and the graveyards and the corpses rising, and to me it just felt like a Spanish horror film.
But they're really sympathetic monsters too, right? I mean, like they're not.
Naschy was a sympathetic werewolf. Come on,
there you go.
Maybe all of Spain, they're sympathetic.
Troy, what were your thoughts?
I had seen this one before. I think I saw it as Strange Love of the Vampire. I seem to recall seeing it years and years ago, bootleg, and obviously seeing it cleaned up and in widescreen makes all the difference. I mean, it's one of three really interesting vampire films that Klimovsky directed in the 70s. The other ones are The Vampire's Night Orgy and the Dracula Saga, and all three of them are really good. This might be my least favorite of the three, but it's still wonderful. It's actually, I would agree, it's probably my favorite film in the set. It plays into that kind of sympathetic, suicidal vampire thing that was going around at the time. If you think of Blackula, for example, the way Blackula ends, or Paul Naschy's film, Count Dracula's Great Love, It has this sort of nice poetic atmosphere. It feels very much like Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Killers and the Hammer film Kiss of the Vampire. Once you get to the vampire ball and all of that stuff is going on, it takes a little while to get started. It's a little clunky in its first act. As a matter of fact, I'd say the same thing about the Naschy film. I think the first half hour is really rough in that movie, but once it settles into its groove, it's really wonderful, and I really love that one too. But yeah, it has a nice kind of poetic quality to it, a sort of melancholy. And again, Klimovsky is an interesting director in that, Naschy was always very appreciative of him because he was the one who directed, Werewolf Shadow, Werewolf versus the Vampire Women, and did a bunch of films together. And appreciated the impact that the films that they worked on had on his career. But he was always critical of him in the sense that he thought he was more concerned with speed than with quality. Klimovsky tended to be very much, it'll do, let's move on. and he didn't follow his movies through post-production, which sometimes resulted in really strange choices being made, like with the music in Vengeance of the Zombies, which some people can't stand, and I kind of like. I don't know, but it's they take the music away, it's not the same movie, so I don't know. I kind of like it. So he was very much a kind of workhorse director, just barreled through all kinds of films and different types of genres, did westerns and horror films and everything else. But I think he brings a nice kind of poetic quality to this film, and it builds to a really memorable finale, I think, as well. So I would say definitely it's, for me, my favorite film in the set.
Well, and it's got, certainly, I think, I don't know if this is true or not, but it feels like it has the biggest budget. It feels like there's some real production value there. It's a really handsomely costumed, and the set design is terrific. Just talking about the set in general, we have, like I say, we have 4 different jewel cases inside of that box. We have an appreciation of each of the films by Angel Sala, who is the Sitges Film Festival programmer, the current one. And it's a nice little, and they're nice and tight. They're about 10 minutes each. And he kind of gives a little context for where the film falls in Spanish history. So it's nice, especially with a film that's unfamiliar, to kind of get an idea as to where this actually lands. And then we have commentary tracks on all 4. So Kat Ellinger does Night of the Walking Dead. Kim Newman does Cross of the Devil, correct?
Yeah, there we go. That's what I thought.
Rod Barnett does Cake of Blood. That's what.
Yes.
And then, Andy Marshall Roberts, host of the Nasty Pasty podcast, covers Necrophagus. Okay, well, that's our little recap of Danza Macabra Volume 3. And Troy, you didn't say one mean thing about the fact that it's an Italian title for a Spanish box set, which it's an interesting kind of that they decided to follow suit, because the first 2 volumes of Danza Macabra were Italian Gothic films, and then suddenly we're in Spanish.
Well, if I say something, then people will get all bent out of shape, and there'll be memes and people making fun of me once more. So
go ahead, Troy. Go ahead.
I know. He likes to stir the pot too. No, I'll just sit here and smile. What I will say is Severin is doing wonderful work as far as cleaning up a lot of these films, and we're talking heavy hitter things like Dario Argento films, including things that nobody ever thought was going to get released in the U.S., like the 5 Days. I mean, amazing. And the deep cuts discs that they put out with all the TV work, and, finally untangling the mess around Four Flies and Gray Velvet. So God bless them for what they do with that, but also all these wonderful Jess Franco releases, and rescuing all these lesser known, and let's be honest, sometimes lesser Italian and Spanish films. I think it's great. And I'm so grateful that they are putting out so many of these movies and putting them out in editions that enable people to, maybe you'll watch it and think, I don't know if I like that very much or not, but maybe you listen to a commentary or watch an interview, a featurette, and it gets the wheels turning, hopefully. So I think that's great.
Well, and I think that's the secret, is you watch it, and if it doesn't necessarily vibe with you, that's where those special features come in handy, because you're like, oh, that's okay. Now I have a better understanding of where this film falls in both the artist's work and the history of, Spanish horror.
Yeah.
John, any final comments?
As I said in the very beginning, 2 of these films I had never heard of. So when you can release a box set of titles that I haven't heard of, especially when they're Spanish, that gets me excited. And seeing them for the first time in the best quality possible, the commentaries are great, because you will learn so much stuff. Not necessarily, it may not make the film better, but the more you know about what goes behind, or they may even have a little context about one of the actors.
Yep.
And that's the thing that I enjoy, because you're seeing more the next time you watch it, more, and you're going to appreciate it more. So I'm all set for that. And yeah, Severin has been knocking it out of the park with these sets.
Well, and that is the fun thing is, when you start getting steeped in any particular genre or subgenre, you do start seeing familiar faces, familiar names, and you kind of feel like you're part of the club. And I think that's something fun that Severin can offer you the opportunity for some of these deeper cuts. And suddenly you feel like you get thrown into that, junior or senior class when you're a freshman. You're like, okay, I'm just going to hang on by my fingernails and go along for the ride. Thank you both for chiming in, because this is one I knew I was going to be wanting to chat about as soon as I'd gotten through the set. Again, this is Scare-A-Thon 2024, benefiting the Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project. If you go to the link in the description of this video, you'll see the link that'll take you to the donation page. Please make a contribution. We are doing these panels and discussions throughout October. Troy Howarth and John Kitley, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all have a great rest of October.
You too.